Hi, virtual students. We're moving into Unit 4, Part 1 here. Your notes are going to look like this, and you'll see you have some columns as well as some, questions to start things off. Here's how things are set up. You're going to get eventually the green is going to tell you where to write things. So what are business cycles? And you'll see here what are business cycles is on there, and then you'll write what's in red, okay? And then eventually we get into our notes and talking about these columns. Same thing, except you'll write things in columns rather than in a row like the question is asking. So that's where we're at. Let's go ahead and get started here. We're starting you out with a quick daily blog. So we've asked you how we know if our economy is doing good or bad, and just really simply put, hopefully you're putting something about how much money people make, maybe more specifically how much money people are able to spend. And again, understanding that money that people spend create income for other people. And so for whatever reason, when an economy isn't doing well, it's because people aren't spending money. That may mean because they're saving it. That may mean because they don't have a job, they don't have an income. It may mean that they're, scared to spend it because of some uncertainty about what's going to happen in the near future. So the big thing to pull from is how do we know our economy is doing good or bad? Okay, and we're going to talk about the stats here, specifically GDP, unemployment, inflation, and what those stats mean as we move forward. So the first thing we're starting out here is talking about these business cycles, and our economy goes through times of good and bad. Very similar to how you are healthy or sick, right? We're healthy most of the time, but when we get sick, sometimes things are really, really bad. And so, economies go through that too because people change their behavior, and different things occur, terrorist attacks or COVID, and those things occur and they make us behave a little bit differently. And our economy's got to adjust, right? We've got to figure out how much money we have to spend on stuff. We've got to be comfortable spending money and going through those types of things. Okay. We mentioned these three stats here. There are four stages of business cycles. We're going to focus on two. Okay. We're going to focus on expansions and contractions. All right. So expansions can be called a couple different things. That this is when an economy is going to grow. Okay. And how do we grow? We produce more stuff. You commonly hear it called recovery. Okay. So mainly what that means is that GDP improves, unemployment is going to decrease, and we've got some stability in knowing that we're going to collect a paycheck and knowing that we can spend it. In times where our economy is doing bad, what happens is we actually produce less. All right. Sometimes it's referred to as a contraction. Sometimes it's referred to as a recession. Um, GDP gets worse, which tie it together. If GDP is how much we produce, we need less people to work. Our unemployment is going to increase. Okay. So those terms are used, especially in the news. You'll be able to, if you watch the news, you'll hear what they say about certain things at certain times. We can draw a really, really symmetrical looking graph here on how, the economy kind of goes through these trends. It's not as simple as that. So we have a graph here of the unemployment rate from, well, pretty historically. And from 1950 to 2020, into the beginning of COVID, even, you can kind of see these are the tops, right, of where unemployment gets to be the worst. All righty. And you can see that the tops they go at different points. Sometimes it gets really bad. Sometimes it gets not so bad. It just kind of depends on what the economy is doing. And then, as you can see over that period of time, after they top off here, things get better over a pretty long period of time. It's kind of like getting the flu, right? If you get the flu, you're really sick for a day or two, and then you may not feel great after 3 or 4 days. You've got to kind of recover, rehydrate, things like that. But eventually you recover. You're healthy way more often than you're sick. But when you're sick, things get really bad really fast. Okay. And so, anyway, this is what a general business cycle will look like again. These gray bars represent recessions. They're different widths, they're different lengths apart. We don't really know all the time when they are going to happen. So you want to know that business cycles are irregular. We can do some things to predict it. We can keep track of a whole lot of statistics. The statistics you need to know are going to be unemployment, inflation, and GDP. Some other things that kind of can tell us are the housing market. House prices are determined by how much people are willing to pay for them. That is determined by how much money you earn and qualify for from a loan from a bank. And so we can use the housing market to kind of see and predict how much money people are making and whether or not the economy is going to sustain its current growth or contraction or whatever. Now, how can you use this information for you? Well, you probably wouldn't want to start a business when the economy is in a recession or going to get in a recession. At the same time, you probably don't want to buy a whole lot of stock when you think the economy is about to enter a recession. And so if you can learn about some of these trends and things like that, you can use it to your advantage. Same thing with quitting a job. You don't want to quit your job if the unemployment rate is high. It's going to be difficult to find one, right? You want to be able to find a job when the economy is growing. We can look at real GDP. We can look at unemployment rate. We're going to look at those significantly later on. A recession is a period of decline for at least 6 months. So our economy has like hiccups, right? It gets like allergies or it gets a cold where it's just like, it's just kind of a crappy couple days. A recession is if I'm sick for an extended period of time. So in this case, 6 months. Okay, so that's the definition. We've talked about what happens when when the economy goes through this. Our prices go down, our income is down, unemployment goes up, and so those things are obviously signs of an extended recession. Can be caused by a few things. Remember, we mentioned at the beginning, any reason that I stop spending money. COVID, I can't spend money. Nothing is open. Terrorist attacks. I stopped spending money because in 9/11 in 2001, people thought we were going to go to war and gas prices were going to skyrocket, so they saved their money. And some other things can kind of cause it too. Usually, it's some kind of a combination of different things, and it has to do with investments as well. Okay, daily blog number 2. Why does our economy need to grow? Is it possible to grow too fast? All right, our economy needs to grow because our population grows, and people want to make more money next year than the year before, and that gives them the feeling that they can spend as much money as they want. That's probably not the correct feeling, but we want people to be comfortable spending money. It creates jobs for other people. So you'll be on your special terms column here in the GDP. There's a few different things we'll look at. You don't need to know too much the difference between nominal and real GDP. Just understand that when we adjust what we're going to look at, it's always going to be mathematically adjusted so we know the statistic that we're looking at. We don't do too much of comparing year to year in terms of how much we produce. We like this stat right here, GDP listed as a percent. So anywhere between 2 and 4% is considered pretty stable, okay, and pretty good. And again, sometimes percentages are somewhat difficult to understand how they're found. But once we say, hey, listen, if it falls between 2 and 4%, we're in good shape. That's what we'll focus on the most. And then we'll also talk about this per capita GDP. We'll get specific with that here shortly. This here is a graph of the United States is up on top here. And down here is China. And it's comparing the two countries' GDP growth. You can see your percentages over here, okay, over the course of, well, several years. All right. And you can see that when we say the United States, somewhere between 2 and 4% is good. Well, you can see we have a bad time period right there. You can say, hey, our economy is no good, right? And you can easily see on a graph what those percentages are. Now, you'll see that China's growing pretty significantly quickly. Like, well, how come China doesn't necessarily have to grow at 2 to 4%? Well, China started kind of at the bottom. And so now they're doing things a whole lot better and they're growing super, super, super fast. Okay, kind of similar to what the United States was experiencing in the early 1900s, where we grew really, really fast with a whole new immigration population and some other things that were going on with technology. The other thing you'll notice is that our economies are related. So you match those years up, okay? Our economies are related because when we don't have money, we don't buy Chinese stuff. They don't need to. They don't need to produce it. So let's figure out what this economy, what this GDP really is. Here's the book definition: market value, all final goods and services produced within a country during a given period of time. Pretty straightforward. We'll simplify and say simply the amount of stuff we produce during a given period of time. Now, notice It's how much we produce. It's not necessarily how much we can consume. And so sometimes we can overproduce and get somewhat of an inaccurate statistic um, in those types of situations. And so keep in mind that it's what we produce, and then during a given period of time, we don't necessarily make you determine those. So we usually look at 3 month periods or 12-month periods. Why is it important? It's gonna measure how much we produce, and we can compare it from one year to the next. Okay, and getting to that point where we say, okay, is our economy better or is it worse? Our population grew by 1%. Our GDP grew by 2%. That's good, right? As a hypothetical situation. Now, the one thing that I want to mention is also, the amount of resources you have available are important. So you've got a question here. So if we were going to measure, okay, these AP situations, and Penn has 150 students pass an exam and Concord has 125, which school is better? Well, you can make the argument for both, but keep in mind that Penn has about twice as many students as Concord. And so really Concord's percentage of AP passers is significantly better than Penn's. And so that's another thing that when we compare the United States and China, China has 4 times as many people. They're producing more stuff than us, just by probably about 10, 15% or so. But that doesn't mean that their economy is necessarily better. We don't get the whole story. One way to get that whole story is to apply that per capita GDP that we defined back on line one. Okay, so some things that cause it. You and I's demand. We kind of talked about that. Businesses act similarly to you and I. If they think that there's going to be money to be made, the economy is doing well, they're going to build buildings, buy machines, and do all these things for business investment. The government can also add to our GDP. The government hires businesses to produce things, roads, buildings, whatever. We will take out, obviously, our exports, our foreign trade. If people buy stuff from us, it adds to GDP. If we buy stuff from other people, it takes away. Okay. So you might be wondering, like, well, if the government can add to GDP, well, how come they just don't buy stuff when the GDP is bad? Well, they've got this little thing called a budget, right? And they can only collect so much money from taxes. And if they spend too much of it, they go more into debt. We're going to talk about that debt more in detail getting into the next unit. Okay, so the government purchases idea, this was FDR's New Deal. If you're familiar with the 1930s, FDR had this plan. Let's have the government provide jobs for people so we can get them some money in their pockets and then they have money to spend. And so, again, it's been successful. Can it be overused? Probably. I don't know what that time is that things are overused, but we'll talk more about that debt, like I said, at a later unit. Okay, next daily blog here. Okay, given some examples of high standard of living. Well, these are things that make our life easier. Here's the definition. Okay, so kind of the big thing is I would say comfort, right? Wealth creates comfort. You can throw material goods in there. Is your life enjoyable? That's your standard of living. And countries with high GDP growth generally have higher standards of living. All right, we've mentioned these throughout the course of the last few slides here is why it's not perfect. Well, if GDP is only measuring, and we're only using GDP to measure like how good of our life is, right, and higher GDP is better, well, keep in mind some things. Number one is it leaves out volunteer work. So volunteer firefighters add zero to GDP. They save people's lives. They can't always keep track of everything. Sometimes things bad happen and it turns into a positive. Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans. New Orleans had to, well, the government purchased these emergency living trailers to ship down to New Orleans. That was really good for somebody's GDP, specifically Elkhart's. Okay, so it does count some negatives as positives. Sometimes, if we only worry about producing stuff, we pollute too much. It ignores those externalities. If we just worry about producing stuff, we've got no leisure time. We value that very, very high. It goes into standard of living. And then it doesn't say if, how rich the rich people are and how poor the poor people are. And so, we might have had a really good GDP in slavery times and the plantation owner had all the money in the world. But obviously the slaves, they are not living a very good life. Right. So, Anyway, it doesn't say anything about who has the money. And if the rich stay really rich and the poor stay really poor, that's not necessarily a good thing. Last thing, if we sustain some GDP growth, we usually see some higher education. Usually, our economies, our country's a little bit healthier, and it improves that standard of living. I kind of already mentioned that. Okay, a couple more things that go in with your standard of living. Again, probably things that you take kind of for granted here in the United States. That's what I've got for you today. Email me with questions. We'll talk soon.